All right, Bears fans, welcome into Picks for Polls, a Chicago Bears draft podcast presented by the Bear Report and Blue Wire Pods. My name, of course, is Andrew Freeman. I'm happy to be your co-host today, and of course, happy to be joined by my other co-host here, Usayd Koshul, as we are following the Bears losing their first game of the 2022 season, recording here on a Wednesday, September 21st, and coming off that Bears loss to the Packers, unfortunately, 27-10, a game that kind of felt all too familiar for us Bears fans here. But you said, despite some of the lows of this last weekend, how are you doing today, man?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Obviously, not an ideal scenario, just the fashion in which the Bears lost, but I'm ready to recap it. I'm ready to get into some playmakers that the Bears should be watching on the offensive side of the ball. And then our old friend Lovie Smith's coming to town for, I think, the second or third time since he's been fired from the Bears about 10 years ago. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about.
Yeah, certainly a lot to talk about today, like you said, and a big focus, I think, on the offense, and rightly so, because I think when we're looking at this past game against the Packers here, if there is one storyline here, and we could focus on the defense. The run defense wasn't great in this last game. Roquan Smith, it seems like he's knocking off the rust, or something's up with him because he did not play great in this last one. The defense as a whole, we saw some splash plays from the pass rush, but the pass coverage wasn't good. The two rookies, Gordon, Brisker, did not have very good games. Gordon in particular was, targeted all game by Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. Like, we could talk about some of that stuff, but I think the major storyline coming up from this game has to be the offense, because it's a common trend with the Bears here in this franchise. This franchise is just allergic to good, forward-thinking, innovative, modern offensive football, it seems. And we're only 2 weeks into the season here, and we don't want to make any broad conclusions too quickly, because a lot can change, a lot can develop over the course of the season. But it was just another one of those nights where the Bears offense started off strong with a opening drive, getting a touchdown on a Justin Fields, a little kind of fake bootleg play for him to go in for a score, to kind of get the game started there after the Packers went down for a score in their first drive. And you kind of started to think that, okay, maybe this could be a game here. These two teams trading blows here early on. I think the Bears defense ended up getting a stop, I believe, in the very next possession. So, you're thinking some positive thoughts for this team moving forward. And then, after that, the offense just completely stalled for the entire first half. Basically, they couldn't get anything going in the passing game. The Packers were able to slow down their running game a little bit for the rest of the first half. And it became much of the same that we've seen over the past few years, really for a long while now for Bears fans, where the offense, just couldn't get anything going. And then Aaron Rodgers eventually found a rhythm and started picking the defense apart in that first half, got them out to a big 24-7 lead at halftime. And from there, it was pretty much over. The Bears, they did some stuff to make it a little bit of a competitive game in the second half. They got the run game going with David Montgomery. David Montgomery was awesome in this game. And, on the subject of looking forward to, future guys in the 2023 drafts and playmakers, running back is looking like a strong spot for this Bears team moving forward into next year, assuming they keep a David Montgomery. So that's, I guess, one positive for this offense moving forward, because Montgomery looked pretty awesome in this game after a pretty bad week one, or pretty underwhelming week one, in the monsoon there. But man, the Bears couldn't get anything going in the passing game. Luke Getsy, I thought, called a really conservative game plan. I think he only called 18 or 19 passing plays the entire game, which is ridiculous when you're down by multiple scores for most of it. And Justin Fields only had 11 passing attempts, adding up to, when you combine the sacks and all that stuff into it, the Bears only having 48 net passing yards in the year of our Lord, in the year 2022, and we have the Bears out here only getting 48 net passing yards. So it was a struggle to watch this offense once again. You say, what were your general thoughts on the game before we kind of dig into it a little bit more?
Well, I really thought it was a typical Bears-Packers showdown, right? You're talking about a team that kind of had a surprise win in week one, specifically because of the conditions. Not a lot of people even expected the Bears to win. And I also think that had Jimmy Garoppolo been starting for the 49ers, instead of, Trey Lance, who's basically a rookie quarterback this year, but is now sidelined with the ankle injury, that it probably would have been a very different game. And plus, let's be honest, like week one's a complete crapshoot. Like we saw the Vikings beat the Packers, and then the Vikings just turned around the very next week and got absolutely destroyed by the Philadelphia Eagles. But ultimately, this was one of those games where it was a typical Bears Packers showing, right? You're talking about a team that basically got blown out in week one by the Packers. They come back week two, and you know what? They were running like a well oiled machine. Now, ultimately, I think you look at this and say that early on, when the Bears had that 7-play, 71-yard drive down the field in 3 minutes and 56 seconds to score a touchdown on their first possession, at that point, you're like, okay, there's something brewing here. But then after that, it was just like punt after punt after punt. And early on, it had the makings of being a heavyweight fight. But unfortunately, this game showed me and you as well, right? Because we're always on the same page about this team. Pretty much like it showed us one thing that a lot of people were not willing to acknowledge in the past. It's just the fact that this is an offense that does not really have the horses needed to compete with any of the big dogs in the NFC. We saw a lot of people throughout the offseason talking about how this is a team that could surprise a lot of people, possibly sneak into the playoffs. And you know what? Well, let's be honest about something. The Bears are far off from a playoff team. They are a team that is in contention probably for like a top 5, top 10 draft pick. And it's simply because they don't have the horses or the playmakers around Justin Fields to really justify this team taking a step forward. And, I wrote this in my kind of post-game article. I talked about how on the subject of David Montgomery and Khalil Herbert, like those guys ran for 160 yards. The Bears were averaging 8.8 yards per rushing attempt, right? The point I'm making is that we've talked all offseason about how the Bears don't have an identity on offense. But I think what it comes down to at the end of the day, and this was so prevalent on Sunday, because every time David Montgomery was given the ball, he was making plays. The Bears have an identity on offense, which is the running game. It's just that the team refuses to fully commit to it. The subject of 11 passes, like play to your strengths and watch the rest of the offense begin to open up.
Well, see, I think this is where we may disagree a little bit here, Usayd, because I think they are committing to the running game. And we look at this Bears offense as a whole in the past 2 weeks. I mean, first of all, week one is a little bit of an outlier in terms of, you're literally playing, in a monsoon. They're like Lake Michigan basically transferred over from Lake Michigan to Soldier Field, basically, because of all the rain and stuff. Like those were less than ideal conditions for an offense, let alone a passing game to function. So they had to run the ball a lot in that game. But, clearly their plan going into this game was to run the ball and run the ball a lot. And when you have the type of running splits like they did have, despite the fact that they were losing for most of the game, a lot of speculation goes into the fact that, maybe they don't trust Justin Fields in this passing game just yet. But I think it more so has to do with the fact that, like you said, they don't really have the horses right now to run a full-fledged, or at least according to the coaching staff right now, really open up the passing game right now, which I think is a wrong assessment to make. Like, even though, they don't have the talent needed, they don't really have ideal talent, but there are still some pieces here to work with, which I think we'll be getting into shortly here, or at least, some pieces that, could be functional if they were able to kind of make it work a little bit with the chemistry of this offense. But, I saw a site out there when you look at expected rushing attempts or expected passing attempts based off of, game situation, what down it is, how many yards to go on the first down, all that stuff. The Bears lead the league far and away in terms of, running the ball more than expected. I think they have they're running the ball 23% more expected than passing the ball compared to the situation that they're in. And we look at the next closest teams. The next closest team is the San Francisco 49ers, a typically run-heavy team who is at about 14%. So you're literally talking about like a 10, 11% difference there, 9% difference between the next team. And then the next closest team after the 49ers is at 8%. So the Bears are a complete outlier right now in terms of their running the ball rate compared to, what you typically expect for a team, given the situations that they've been in on offense so far this year. And again, some of that has to do with the week one, the weather situation. Some of that goes into, what the game plan was in this past game where they did have a lot of success in the ground. So like you said, why go away with it? But the reason why I bring that up is because, we look at what's the purpose of this year. You look at Ryan Poles throughout the offseason, trading away Khalil Mack, eating a bunch of dead money to move on from some veterans, not really spending a ton in free agency, kind of getting the cap sheet worked out to be more advantageous for this team going into next year to make some splashes in free agency, with them having over $100 million in projected cap space. What is this year all about? Well, I would say that this year, especially with the fact that they're starting a bunch of young guys all across the roster, this is a development year. This is about seeing what you have in the young guys. And who's the one young guy in this roster that you need to get the most information out of in terms of knowing what he is moving forward? That's Justin Fields. Justin Fields is the number one priority in terms of, finding out what you can for him this season. It's not David Montgomery. He's going to be a free agent next year. You don't need to find out what he is. We already know what he is. He's established. We know what he is. Whether you want to pay him or not, that's kind of the question you got to determine, I guess. But we know what David Montgomery is, but we don't know what Justin Fields is. And we need to see what he is moving forward. And you're not going to see what Justin Fields is by him only throwing the ball 11 times a game in a game where, you should be throwing the ball a lot because you're losing the entire game. So why not try to open it up a little bit? And some of this goes to the play calling decisions, a lot of second and long runs, a lot of, basic play calls on first down, just basic runs on first down, not really throwing the ball in early downs. And what that means is that you're putting Justin Fields in a lot of disadvantageous positions on third and long where he has to throw the ball with the defense knowing he has to throw the ball, and you put yourself in troublesome situations with that. So that's probably my big spiel on the running game aspect of things, because it was apparent in this game they were trying to run the ball, and I think some of the players said it afterwards in the post game press conference that Getsy wanted to run the ball in this game, and it was pretty clear because they ran the ball, and to give them credit, they did run the ball pretty well in this one.
Yeah, like I said, they average 8.8 yards per carry, and I think it's really encouraging to see because if we're going to be honest, David Montgomery's been one of those players over the last couple of years who the Bears should have gotten way more out of, but they never really did because of porous offensive line play. Now, when I kind of look at things moving forward, like the run game should obviously be a priority because I think it's all about how you have two really good running backs in Herbert and Montgomery. You combine that with a dual threat quarterback like Justin Fields, and effectively, you are going to keep defenses guessing at times. But I think the overall bigger story here is when you talk about what exactly the future includes is that there are certain players on this roster, right? Like a Cody Whitehair, for example. Not really a guy that you're going to build for the future, or even a player like Robert Quinn. I mean, I think I saw somewhere, I believe it was on Over the Cap, if the numbers are correct, the Bears could move on from both next year, Quinn and Whitehair, and save, I think it's something like $20 or $30 million in cap space, which again, there's a lot of young players like a Jalen Johnson, Travis Gibson, Darnell Mooney that could be in line for extensions that the Bears could decide to hand them, some deals to kind of make them part of the long-term future in Chicago. But in context of like who's stepped up over the first 2 weeks of the season, I would say, one guy who sticks out for me is defensive end Travis Gibson. You're talking about a player that the previous regime drafted in the 5th round. He was labeled as incredibly raw, spent most of his rookie season inactive and kind of just on the sidelines, kind of took a step forward in 2021, had about 6 sacks as a sophomore, and then really this year he's popped off because the last 2 seasons he was playing as a 3-4 defensive end. This year, though, Gibson's playing as a 4-3 defensive end, and essentially, it's a position that he played while he was in college. So a lot of what the Bears are doing is just so similar. I mean, I saw a stat somewhere where he's right up there in terms of pressures. He's got 8, which is up there with a lot of the elite edge rushers in the NFL. So, Travis Gibson's one name to continue watching.
Yeah, Gibson's been really good these first 2 weeks. And I watched him this past game, and it's interesting because he's not out there a lot, doesn't get a ton of snaps when he's out there, but when he is on the field, he's constantly making plays, he's constantly being disruptive. Now, some of that is Yeah, no, he's kind of been getting some favorable matchups in terms of, a lot of his pressures have been unblocked because teams like to do these rollouts and they've rolled out to his side. And, he's not biting on those rollout fakes. Like he's going after the quarterback and, he's disrupted some plays because of that. So those are good things to see. You want to see a guy who's instinctive in space like that and is willing to make a play on those bootlegs because that's such a big part of the NFL now. But Gibson, he had a really nice game against the Packers. He was able to beat, Elgin Jenkins, his first game back from his injury at right tackle for the Packers. He's one of the better young offensive linemen we have in the NFL today. Travis Gibson beat him multiple times in this game to get after Aaron Rodgers. He had multiple sacks in this game. He looked really good. Like he looks legitimately like he's going to be, I think, I don't know about like a future Pro Bowler or All Pro or a future stud for this team. Not one of those true impact elite guys that you talk about, but I think he's a guy that you look at. He's got some stud attributes to him. I think he can be a building block for this defense moving forward. Maybe as not the guy moving forward, but certainly a guy that you can build as part of your defensive line rotation as a key guy. And he can do some things for you as a pass rusher. I like what they're doing with him. Him and Dominique Robinson, who we have to mention as well, he stepped up in his first two games. I think he had a fumble recovery in this game as well, if my memory serves me correctly, on kind of a broken play from the Packers. But one of the things that I like to see with them is being creative with those two guys. Putting one of those guys inside a little bit. I mean, there was one play where Travis Gibson was lined up inside on a pass rushing snap. Him and Dominic Robinson were on the same side. Gibson's on the inside. Robinson's on the outside. They were on a stunt. That freed up Robinson to get after Aaron Rodgers, leading to a Robert Quinn sack. So those are some of the things you like to see. So I like to see that. So Gibson, Robinson, those two for me up front. I feel good about those two young players moving forward on the edge. And it makes me feel a lot safer moving on from a guy like Robert Quinn right now because those are two guys I want to see get more reps. And honestly, they're playing Al-Qadim Muhammad a lot of snaps, and I don't know how long I can stomach watching Al-Qadim Muhammad get more snaps than Travis Gibson and Dominique Robinson. Like those two have absolutely flashed over the first 2 weeks. And again, we talk about this being a development year. I think for this coaching staff moving forward, you have to get those guys more snaps than Muhammad moving forward if you're not going to move Quinn because, Muhammad's not a long-term piece here. Gibson and Robinson definitely have the potential to be, though. For me, I look at the secondary here. Jalen Johnson's had a really nice start to the year. I believe he hasn't been targeted yet, or if he has, he's only been targeted like once or twice this year. Like clearly, teams are going after other guys in the secondary to pick apart. We look at Kyler Gordon getting picked apart a little bit. They're targeting Brisker a little bit. Some of these other corners that they're targeting, Vildor, obviously. So they're going after other guys here. They're not going after Jalen Johnson. So some of that is, wanting to take advantage of some of these younger defensive backs on this roster that aren't as good as Jalen Johnson. But also, teams clearly have a respect for Jalen Johnson as a presence at that other cornerback spot on the right side. And, he's had a good start to the year. He had that forced fumble in week one that really, really helped change the outcome of that game because if the 49ers go and score a touchdown there early in that one, that really changes the entire outlook of that game. And Jalen Johnson with that forced fumble really set the tone for what that day was going to be as kind of a sloppy affair. So Johnson, he's been good. He's looked solid on tape when you look at him in coverage, even though he's not really active because they're not really throwing to him. But I think Johnson, look at him, he's another guy in defense that I feel confident that's going to be a long-term piece for this team moving forward.
Yeah, Jalen Johnson's one who is, like you said, kind of a name to keep an eye on. Dominique Robinson is another phenomenal name. And then that, I think right now might actually be leading the Bears in sacks with 1.5 total sacks. But, another player that I think is really worth mentioning, and this is a guy who, kind of arrived in Chicago as a free agent during the offseason, still relatively young in his career. I think he's in his 5th or 6th season at this point, but that's wide receiver Equanimeous St. Brown. Now, I understand he was with the Packers the first 3 or 4 years of his career, kind of dealt with a lot of injuries, but he's developed a nice chemistry with Justin Fields. And quite frankly, let's be honest, he is the red zone target that if this team starts getting into the red zone, you could see Fields target Equanimeous St. Brown more. Ultimately, you look at it, and like we've mentioned multiple times, the Bears don't necessarily have any top-tier playmakers at the wide receiver position. You look at a guy like Byron Pringle, who they gambled on in free agency. Well, I mean, Pringle really has not impressed at all much this year, but St. Brown's one of those guys because of his familiarity with Luke Getsy, the chemistry he's developed with Justin Fields. I mean, I would not be surprised to see him sign a 2 or 3 year deal in Chicago during the 2023 offseason to kind of allow him to be one of the faces of the Bears playmaking core moving forward. I mean, I just think that ultimately you look at the state of this offense, right? And there are multiple ways to go about it, right? You could focus on what the Bears have right now, and then you could also look at what the Bears can eventually develop into in the future. And I think it's more so about the future because if we're being completely transparent, this a lot of what this offense is going to look like in 2 to 3 years is not necessarily on the roster yet, right? You're looking at obviously Justin Fields. You are looking at Darnell Mooney as being a long-term building block. Like those are your top two guys right now. But then you look at a first-round pick coming up in the 2023 draft. You could look into adding a playmaker there. You're not, as a new regime, I think, fully sold on guys like Tevin Jenkins and Larry Bourne. I still think that both of them have to prove their worth, especially being on those cheap rookie deals. The Bears could decide to cut bait with them if need be, or even possibly flip them for some sort of trades. Braxton Jones is a name that, has been up and down so far and just has really yet to find consistency. And we're being fully honest, like the fan base fell in love with Braxton Jones this offseason. I was impressed with what I saw with Braxton Jones, but also if he continues to consistently be an inconsistent player, then guess what? Next offseason, it is warranted if you look into upgrading at left tackle because if we're going to be fully honest, like this team has not had a franchise caliber left tackle in forever. And for the Bears, if you have an opportunity to upgrade there, whether it's signing someone in free agency, which is unlikely because of the way the left tackle market's gone, or even drafting and developing a player, you take it by all means. And, I should also mention, it's like you look at Eberflus and Pohl's previous teams, the Chiefs and Colts, and both of them drafted offensive linemen relatively high. Like when Eberflus was with the Colts, they drafted, Quentin Nelson in the first round, who I think was the 5th overall pick that year. So lose a top 10 pick to my knowledge. But the point is, it's like when Poles was also in Kansas City, they drafted Eric Fisher 1st overall. And that's when Poles was kind of at the bottom of the ladder in terms of the work he was doing. So the point is that it's like, a lot of this offense and what this offense is going to develop into in terms of talent, it's not necessarily fully on the roster, but there's still a lot of upgrades to be made. So I think no one's safe.
Yeah, no one's safe. And, currently I look at this offense. I mean, you bring up Equanimeous St. Brown. Like, I think he has had some nice moments here. I'm not sure how sustainable that is towards him being a long-term piece, though, because you look at his touchdown against the 49ers, like that's just more of an example of Getsy scheming him open, and kind of the same thing against, the Packers on that flea flicker play, which is a big play, made a nice play after the catch. But I'm still not sold on Equanimeous St. Brown. I know he has a relationship with Getsy, but there's a reason why he was brought in on a vet minimum contract. Like, he's not really seen as anything much around the league, and certainly wasn't seen as much by the Packers, where they were willing to let him go, despite the fact that their receiving core wasn't very good. So I still it's a wait and see for me with the Equanimeous St. Brown, but I've been a little bit impressed with what he's been able to do and his opportunities so far. One player that has disappointed me at wide receiver though has been Darnell Mooney to start off the year, and I think he only has 2 catches to start the season. Like, he hasn't been a part of the game plan so far, and that's really disappointing because going into the season I thought Darnell Mooney would be kind of playing that. Not like being Devontae Adams as good as Devontae Adams, but kind of playing that Devontae Adams role in this offense where he's going to be getting the bulk share of targets in this offense. They're going to move him around all over the place. And he's going to be the guy that Justin Fields is looking for on any given play to get the ball to and third downs. And, whenever they need a big drive on offense in the passing game to get him the ball. And that hasn't come up whatsoever. Like, Darnell Mooney has been a complete no-show in this offense. I think both of his catches have been screens that, one of them worked against the 49ers, but this last one against Green Bay, they sniffed it out and they did not work in that one. So, Darnell Mooney, I still believe he's a long-term piece. I feel good about him, but I think we're starting to see that, some of my concerns going into this year, a lot of Bears fans were hyping up Darnell Mooney as this number one type of wide receiver, this alpha type of guy that you can build a wide receiver core around. And, me and a lot of other people like basically we're like, I mean, we like Darnell Mooney. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Darnell Mooney. I love what he brings, but this whole talk about him being a number one is a little bit premature because there's, it's one thing to be that number two option and to soak up targets. When Allen Robinson does go down, to step up and get a lot of targets, but it's another thing to be the entire linchpin of an entire offense in the passing game to build around at that wide receiver spot, where defenses now are focusing on you and trying to scheme around you, so to speak, because the Bears don't have any other options that you're worried about. So for Darnell Mooney, it's kind of that adjustment where now he's the undisputed number one guy. And so far, he's learning that being the number one guy isn't as easy as it can be, as it can seem sometimes. And just because you're getting a lot of production as a number one guy last year doesn't mean it's going to translate now that you are the full-time number one guy. So it's kind of been, I wouldn't say I like that this is how it's played out, but it's played out kind of the way I thought in terms of the fact that, Darnell Mooney, he's a really good player. I think he's a long-term piece. He fits nicely with Fields. And I mean, we've yet to see it this year, but those two clearly have a nice chemistry together based off of what we saw last year. But I think moving forward, you can't go into next year assuming that he's your number one guy moving forward. You have to. I think he's a guy that you can build around, that you can keep as part of your core moving forward, but he's not a guy that I'm building my receiver core around, so to speak. Like, I think the Bears should be aggressive to try to upgrade that position and get a true number one guy. I don't know who's going to be available because the free agency pool isn't really great. We can talk about some draft options coming up soon, but the wide receiver position, once again, it's going to be a position of need going forward into next year. You touched on Byron Pringle. Byron Pringle is what it is. Like, he was a fourth option in Kansas City for a long time. He was a special teamer guy. He got opportunities last year, but again, it's easy to look good when you're playing as Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce all the times, and with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. So, completely different situation. He was asked to be number two, and he hasn't really shown anything. And Village Jones, will see. Hopefully he gets back from his hamstring. But the one thing I want to talk about here before we kind of talk about the offensive line a little bit more, we need to have a conversation about Cole Kmet, because what is Cole Kmet? Like, obviously I've never been very high on him, but this last game was not a very good showcase for Cole Kmet. Obviously his blocking wasn't very good in this one. He had that one block in the Darnell Mooney screen where he just missed his guy. And again, I don't think he's been a great blocker anyway throughout his first couple of years in the NFL. And then, my concerns about him as a receiver have played out so far. He didn't do anything in the 49ers game. That wasn't really his fault, but he had some opportunities in this Packers game, and he had that one really bad drop on that one play and was a no-show besides that. So Cole Kmet, what are your thoughts? Do you think he's done anything to prove himself as a long-term piece, or do you think that the Bears, should be looking to try and upgrade if he doesn't really step it up here over the next few weeks?
Yeah, I don't think he's really done anything to prove that he's a long-term piece. And again, here's why. Because let me take a step back first off. When I rank outside of the quarterback, right, the three most experienced playmakers on this offense, you've got David Montgomery, and you've got Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney, right? Now, at least with Montgomery and Mooney, you've seen enough throughout the last couple seasons to say, you know what, these are guys that any new regime around the NFL would welcome. Okay. I mean, especially Mooney, who had, just under 1,100 yards receiving last year. Montgomery, another really phenomenal running back, by the way, who I think loses out on production, has lost out on production because of a bad offensive line over the last couple of years. But then there's Cole Kmet. And Cole is, I understand he's like a hometown hero, who's a hometown favorite, but Cole's incredibly polarizing, specifically because when I look at him as